But as they say, the show must go on. I do hope you keep your spirits up. I do hope you continue to be safe. And I don't mean the bearer to be the bearer of bad news, but as we'll see in this lecture, I believe that frankly the coronavirus will get worse again over the coming months, and so it's particularly important that we be vigilant, that we be cautious, and I know that's what the management is doing with you. So let me jump into the lecture, and I'm going to talk exclusively about the election today, but I'm not going to talk about the election exclusively from the perspective of who's doing what in the polls or what happened last week in the news. I will talk with you a little bit about that, but what I'd really like to concentrate on today is what I think are the underlying factors that are driving what is kind of an improbable scenario in this election, which, to be blunt, is that the incumbent president appears to be headed for a significant loss, and that he's dragging a party that has many structural advantages behind it, the Republican Party, down with him. And so I want to look at, on the one hand, the economy, and on the other hand, the pandemic as the explanation for the current political dynamics that we're seeing. And so I'm going to start with what's happening in the presidential race. And what we know is that Joe Biden has a substantial lead over Donald Trump. And that lead can be seen in the polling at a national level, where Donald Trump is trailing Joe Biden by about 10 percentage points. That is, when we do the average of all of the polls, it looks like Biden has about a 10-point lead. We can see this at the state by state level, and we can see this in models that try to predict the outcome of the election. And so the model I prefer, which is the model from the 538 website, which takes into account a whole bunch of factors, has Joe Biden with about an 87% chance of winning, Donald Trump with about a 13% chance of winning. That goes up and down a little bit, but at this point that seems to be fairly stable. And of course, what this really reflects is what's happening at the state level. And what we see, and what I'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes, is that those states that were critical to Donald Trump's victory over Hillary Clinton in 2016, and here we're talking about Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, are all in Joe Biden's column right now. And in the past, when I've told you that, there'd been a substantial discrepancy between the national polls and what was happening in those so-called swing states. And in the last couple of weeks, it's emerged that the swing states are looking more like the nation. If Biden is leading Trump by 10 points in the nation, he's also leading him by almost 10 points in Minnesota and Michigan. In Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, it's more like 7 or 6 points, but that's a wide enough margin that not only is it well outside of the polling margin of error, it's also unlikely to be overcome by systemic bias in the polling of the kind that we saw in 2016, right? The polls were not detecting that some of the Trump voters were out there and actually likely to vote. Even if we have those kinds of mistakes at this point, it still appears that the lead that Biden has over Trump in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota is robust, and that we're in a sense focusing more now on Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, all of which are also in Biden's column at the moment, though not as strongly in his column. And one of the things you may be noticing, Donald Trump, who's made a remarkable recovery from the coronavirus, is back out on the trail, but he's campaigning in Florida and Iowa and Wisconsin, of those three states, really only Wisconsin should be a place that he needs to worry about right now. So the fact that he's worried about Florida and Iowa indicates that his campaign is in trouble, that he's playing defense, that in a sense, he's currently concentrating on trying to avoid a landslide loss more than on winning a victory. I'll say one more thing about this, which is that since, in particular, the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court to replace Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Democrats have seen a remarkable funding increase. Donations from small donors and big donors have been pouring in. And that at the same time, many of Donald Trump's big donors appear to have lost confidence in him and are withholding their contributions. And so Donald Trump, who has bought ads in Iowa and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, is pulling those ads on the radio and the TV because they cost more than he has in the campaign coffers. He's going to concentrate on social media advertising, which is much less expensive. And so when we look at things at the state level, not to lose the forest for the trees, again, things look very good for Joe Biden. Now, the last thing I want to say is looking at the overall trend line in this election. What typically happens in an election cycle is that the candidates see a bump, a bounce after the conventions. And in fact, if we look at the trend line, the closest this race has been in the last 4 months is probably at the very beginning of September, right after Donald Trump's nominating convention. But what we expect to see after that bump is a kind of winnowing, a narrowing of the gap between the candidates. Americans are actually quite set in their partisan identities and quite evenly split between the two parties. And so usually voters come home to their party and its candidate as we approach a national election. And so what we expect to see is a narrowing gap. And in fact, what we have seen is a widening gap from September, when Biden's chances were in the roughly 65% territory, to the middle of October, where Biden's chances are now in the 87% territory. And so that's really what I want to focus on today. This is unusual. This is unexpected that we would have a widening gap. And in a sense, Donald Trump is as unpopular, as down in the polls as any presidential candidate has been since Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford, by the way, is the only incumbent who was in this territory, right? And so, but as an incumbent, there's a general trend that they win re-election. And in particular, there's also this trend that almost all recent presidential elections have been reasonably close. This one looks to be bucking that trend. Why is that? Before turning to my analysis, I just want to complete the electoral update by pointing out to you that if you were to take out of the picture all the states in which the gap is only 3 percentage points or less, and so say those are too close to call, and only give Biden the states where he's clearly ahead and Trump the states where he's clearly ahead, Biden wins a strong victory. He has 335 electoral college votes, and he only needs 270, right? If we were to give Biden every state that he's currently ahead in, and Trump every state that he's currently ahead in, Biden wins a decisive landslide, 375 electoral college votes to Trump's 163. If the polls are as wrong today as they were in 2016 as biased against Trump, in other words. And by the way, I don't think that they are. But if they were, Biden would still win. A relatively comfortable victory with 319 electoral college votes. And as we go down and look across the line at the different states that are contested states, Biden is ahead in almost every one of them: Ohio, Georgia, Iowa, North Carolina, Florida, right? These are states that there's really no scenario for the president winning if he doesn't carry all of them. Biden is ahead in all of them. And even if the polls are as wrong as they were in 2016, then the president is doing okay in roughly 4 of those states. But in Florida and Arizona, he's still behind. So this is very unusual. And I'll say a couple more things about this to analyze this. And now I'm going to focus on those key Midwestern states: Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and look at what Pennsylvania as well. Look at what happened in 2016 when Trump won. The voters who had voted for Obama by roughly 3 percentage points, right? And so that's the in a sense why the election went the way it did. Of those voters now, 43% of them have switched back to Biden. Of the voters who voted for minor party candidates, 34% of them have switched back to Biden. Of the voters who were non-voters, who basically just sat out the 2016 election, 14% of them have switched back to Biden. And that means that overall, Biden is now up 6 points, where Trump was up 3 points in those key Midwestern states among these key subcategories of voters. And in a sense, we're getting very granular now, but I want you to understand where this is coming from. And I'll just say one more thing before now I transition into my analysis. Trump is not only suffering badly in the polls. He's not only on his way to a historic loss, he is dragging his party down with him. The people who look at what's happening in the House suggest that there's an excess of a 90% chance that the Democrats will pick up seats in the House where they already have control. Of course, what really matters here is the Senate. And people who analyze this think that the Democrats now have better than a 2/3 chance of claiming a narrow victory in the Senate as well. That there are enough seats that they can flip, that they can survive losing one of their seats, which will almost certainly happen in Alabama. And I want to be clear about this. When we looked at this from the outside, from before the contest began, just based on where the Senate votes were this year. Remember that basically only 1/3 of the Senate seats turn over every election cycle. This looked like an election that favored the Republicans. They had more seats to defend, but their seats were in solidly conservative states. And so the idea that the Democrats might pick up a Senate seat in Montana, in Maine, in Colorado, that they might even be within striking distance of picking up a Senate seat in Alaska. All of that indicates that this is another what's sometimes called blue wave election cycle. That is to say, election in which the Democrats are going to do better than their baseline level of support, because a substantial number of voters who normally vote Republican are going to vote for the Democrats in this election. That typically happens in a midterm election when the incumbent's party tends to suffer some setbacks. It doesn't typically happen in a presidential election, especially when there's an incumbent running. So again, unusual things are happening in the polls and in American democracy this year. So how do we explain this? And I want to start with the virus. And I'm showing a diagram on Zoom, which I will summarize for those of you on the phone, that shows, and I want to use careful terminology here, that there have been two peaks in viral transmission so far in the United States in this pandemic. And I am avoiding the language of waves because waves makes it sound like the virus goes away and the virus comes back. That's a misunderstanding. That is not what is happening here. What is happening is that the rate of transmission increases and decreases. So we have a peak and a trough, not a wave. And there have been two peaks so far, one in April and one in the middle of July. And I want to unpack this a little bit more, but first I want to point out that since mid-September, we've been seeing increased transmission. And now when we look at this on the diagram, it does look like we are on our way to another peak. It's not increasing the transmission as rapidly as it did in July or April, and that's a good thing. But it, frankly, in my analysis, may go up higher. It may be a worse peak when all is said and done, and I will explain to you why I'm concerned that that might be the case. But let's start with the April peak. And the April peak has a particular demographics and geography to it. It is concentrated in coastal cities. And these are the cities that are connected to the global transportation infrastructure. So lots of people from Europe and Asia are coming to these cities, and that's probably why the virus starts in these cities. And these cities tend to be more densely populated, to use public transportation, to have a large portion of relatively poor or working class workers who live in sometimes multi-family units who have to work side by side or close in person. And so there's a particular scenario that leads to the rapid spread of the virus in April. Now, those cities put policies in place, and they have rapid policy responses, whether it's mask wearing or closing down businesses or closing down schools, that are successful at combating the virus. But that's not to say the virus goes away. And that's why I don't like that wave metaphor. What happens is that viral transmission goes down. But we are an interconnected country, right? People travel in our country, and this is spring. In the summertime, students go home from college. People go to the beach, see their relatives, etc. And so at the same time that the virus remained active, despite the fact that it was not peaking in the spring and into the early summer, it migrated, and it migrated into the South and the Midwest. And when we see the second peak, the peak that occurred in July, that's more widespread. And it's in regions where public health officials, local politicians, and the population as a whole were more reluctant to put into place policies or to follow norms and rules that suppress viral transmission. So the July peak is more than twice as high as the April peak, despite the fact that it's not occurring in as big of cities. It's occurring in Atlanta and Houston, which are pretty big cities, but it's not occurring in New York or Los Angeles at this point, right? Or at least to the same degree. But the fact is that eventually people in those areas began to put in place policies, began to follow directions, began to do things that are self-protective. And so the viral transmission slowed again. And so the second half of the summer, we see it come down, never really below what had been the previous peak. And so if you were looking at this diagram, you would see a peak in April, and then slowing, and then a peak in July, and then a slowing, where the trough that follows the July peak is in fact higher than the April peak. And what worries me is that this is not just idiosyncratic, this is a pattern. And so what we're going to see as things start to rise in October again is that the next peak will be higher and maybe considerably higher. Please note that with the July peak, weather was on our side, right? People could do things out of doors, and we know that the virus is much less contagious. It's primarily airborne. When you're out of doors, it disperses much more rapidly. When you're forced indoors by the weather, these are good conditions for viral transmission. And so I now want to transition, but I just want to be clear. This is a major public policy failure. We have been dealing with the virus for over 6 months. We have never really got it under control. This is in part because we're not testing frequently enough. We have not made tests readily available enough. For some people, they're still unavailable. For others, they're prohibitively expensive. We don't have a uniform testing policy, and so we don't have reliable data on the virus. We do not have tracking. That is to say, once we discover that somebody has the virus, we are not able to figure out who they've been in contact with to tell them, to warn them, to get them to not continue to spread the virus. And please remember, there's a lot of stealth transmission with this virus. That is to say, people who are contagious but not symptomatic, who then give it to other people before they recognize that they are contagious. And those other people may be much more vulnerable than the people who are spreading the virus. And we have failed to get compliance with really simple, basic public health norms: wearing masks, avoiding large gatherings, avoiding gatherings indoors, maintaining social distance, right? And I will readily admit, these are not only uncomfortable and inconvenient, right? In certain respects, these disrupt very important aspects of life. And I'll give you my own example. I have a mother who's in a nursing home who I don't know how much longer she will be alive for. She's not well. I have not been able to see her throughout this entire period. The home mainly will not let me in, but it's in California, and I don't think it's safe for me to travel there. And if I did travel, I would have to sequester for a couple weeks, and that would, in a sense, defeat the purpose of going. So this is not easy for me to do, but I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. And there's something that in the public health literature is called peer norming. If everybody around you is wearing a mask, it's much more difficult for you not to wear a mask, right? You become the peculiar person, and perhaps people confront you about it because you're putting them at risk. But if half the people around you aren't wearing masks, or if a large portion of the people who are wearing masks are not wearing them effectively, right, they don't have their nose covered, etc., then it's much easier to get away with, to not be stigmatized for or sanctioned for not conforming to the norms. And that is the situation we are in our society. We don't have the testing, we don't have the tracking, we don't have leadership that is modeling and enforcing basic public health norms. And so the reason that our transmission has never been brought under control and appears to be headed to another peak is because of a failure of public policy. Now, as we're seeing in Europe, public policy alone would not eliminate the virus. It will come back, and it will come back until there is an effective vaccine. And fortunately, the therapeutics are better today than they were in April. And so probably fewer people will die per case in the next peak than died in the previous peaks. And that is good news and that is progress, but it's not, frankly, sufficient. And I do now want to concentrate not just on transmission, but deaths as well. And I'm showing some data that looks at not only the deaths that have been reported and identified from COVID-19, and there are now over 220,000 of those deaths, but what are called excess deaths. And so we have data going back over years that show us how many people die each month of each year. And we can average those data, we can look at trends, and we can get a prediction how many people should have died from March to the middle of September of 2020. How many people actually did die? And what we see is that about 280,000 people died over that period, which means that there are about 80,000 deaths above average that are not being counted as COVID deaths, but that are almost certainly directly or indirectly caused by the virus. And to explain for a moment, some of this may be that we didn't do the test, that we didn't categorize appropriately. And so there are people who died of COVID-19 who are not categorized of having died of COVID-19. But it is also the case that our public health system is built for efficiency. It's built to handle the average caseload and not to be able to handle illness, disease, health crises that exceed the typical amount. A quick illustration of this is to think about an airplane. Airplanes can be very efficiently designed with a single jet engine. We don't do that. We don't do that because if the jet engine fails, the plane falls out of the sky. That's not where we want to be, right? And so we build jet airplanes with at least two engines, so there's some redundancy, some fallback or failsafe. We tend not to build our hospitals that way. There's not much excess bed capacity. There aren't many excess respirators, etc. And so part of what's happened during this pandemic is that the capacity of the public healthcare system has been exceeded. And some of these excess deaths may not be of COVID-19. They may be of heart attacks or strokes or people who had operable conditions but were unable to get the operation on time. And so really we should trace those deaths as indirect COVID-19 or pandemic deaths. And the result is that we have about 20% more people dying than we would in a given year. And some of those people are young, and some of those people are in their prime. Some of those people are middle-aged. I want to be clear about this, right? That people who survive the virus, who are young or in their prime or in their middle ages, often suffer debilitating health consequences for weeks or months, sometimes half a year later. They are still unable to return to their normal routines. And so the overall cost of this virus is not just measured in deaths, but even if we're measuring deaths, the deaths are higher than the official statistics indicate. And so then when we go back to thinking about why this peculiar thing is happening, why is it that this race is not tightening? Why is it that Biden has maintained such a substantial lead for so long? I think the first thing to notice is that this is a core function of government, arguably the core function of government, which is to say, you keep your citizens alive, you maintain their well-being. And this government has abjectly failed to do that. And the result is that Donald Trump is being held responsible by a significant portion of the electorate. We know that 20% of Republicans disapprove of his handling of the virus. We know that 90% of Democrats and 2/3 of independents disapprove of his handling of the virus. And this is part of the reason that, as opposed to the race tightening, Joe Biden appears to be actually widening his lead. And I've indicated before that I do believe that there is some magical thinking in the White House about the virus. I believe Donald Trump has been waiting for the silver bullet, for the breakthrough, for the virus to go away, for a vaccine to be developed. And that is not the way to combat a virus. We will, let us hope, have a vaccine probably widely distributed within 9 months, a year, right? And we can't be certain of that. We have to be careful in the meantime, not just careful, but pursue effective public policy. And the fact that the government hasn't done that, and that an administration led by a president standing for re-election has failed in this way, is bringing such a substantial drag onto his re-election prospects that it's very difficult to overcome. But there's a second dimension of this, and I now want to turn to the economy. And I'm going to start with the human dimension of this. And I'm showing a diagram that looks at poverty rates. And there's something interesting about this diagram, which is that in February of 2020, the number of Americans in, or I should say below the poverty line in the United States was about 11%. And over the spring of 2020, this year, that fell to around 9%. That's peculiar, right? That during a pandemic, the poverty rate would go down. But I want to be clear why that is. That is because of the CARES Act, right? An act passed by Congress, signed by the president, that gave all Americans or anyone who qualified a $1,200 stimulus check, and in particular, increased unemployment benefits across the board by $600 per person per week. And so rather than poverty going up in the early stages of the coronavirus when employment fell off a cliff, it actually went down. This is what good public policy looks like. But what we see is, beginning in June, the poverty rate starts to go up again. And this is complicated. It's not a single factor explaining this. Part of this is that those $1,200 checks went out in April and May. The effect that they had was gone by June. Part of this is that this is the beginning of the second peak. And so economies are closing down, people are losing jobs, and that pushes them into poverty. But what happened additionally is that in late July, that $600 supplemental unemployment insurance benefit expired, and it has not been replaced since then. And so we have more Americans in poverty, and let's humanize this. This means more families unable to afford to feed their children 3 meals a day, unable to pay their rent, unable to pay their doctor bills, perhaps struggling to afford the cost of getting to work, right? This is what poverty means in this country. The poverty rate is set quite low. If you are below that level, you are making serious sacrifices and experiencing often quite dire vulnerability. I want to just focus for a moment on childhood poverty and point out that what we know is that children who experience hunger and food vulnerability when they are young suffer lifelong consequences, literally consequences from malnourishment, which interfere with physical growth, consequences from not getting the right mix of nutrients that interfere with brain development, but also psychological trauma that affects self-esteem, a sense of security, and one's relationship to food across one's life. And so this is not to be taken lightly. This, again, is a deep and lamentable failure of public policy in the United States. Now, I'm going to show a little bit more information on this, and what I'm showing is what the poverty rate would have been had we not passed this policy, and what in fact it was when we passed this policy. And I'm breaking this into two different categories: poverty and deep poverty. Deep poverty is people who have less than half of the federal poverty limit. And what we're seeing is that the deep poverty rate would have gone up to around over 9%, and instead it stayed in the 6 to 7% range because of public policy. And we can see this in a more concrete way by looking at the way in which both the unemployment benefits and the stimulus checks drove poverty down month by month. In March and April and May, the stimulus checks drove poverty down. In April, May, June, and July, the unemployment benefits drove poverty down. But as we see, beginning in August and September, it was much less effective because those benefits expired. All right, so let me now transition from poverty to looking at the economic consequences of these benefits, first for families. And so this is very interesting data that we have access to that is really quite new and novel. We can now, based on complex regulations and reporting, see how much people on average have in their savings accounts. And part of what we see is that people who received the unemployment benefits increased their savings from March through July by over 100%. And I just want to be clear about this, because people sometimes think that the dole handout, people just spend it irresponsibly. These people were very responsible with the money they received. They saved it. And in fact, their savings as a percentage of where it was before the pandemic went up much more than did the savings of people who were employed. But when those benefits expired in July, there's been a rapid decline in the savings of the unemployed. More than half of the increase in their savings has been eliminated just between July and August, which is the most recent data we have. We can also look at the expenditure data. And what we see is that people who started to receive that unemployment insurance supplement were not spending very much at all when those supplements came in, but increased their weekly spending from around $350 in mid-March to as much as almost $700 in late June. And that this, to be clear, is obviously good for these families. This means they are providing food for their children. Let's hope they are paying their rent, etc. it's also good for the economy as a whole, right? This is stimulative, and we know that the American economy is driven by consumer spending. And so when people who lose their jobs are given money to sustain them, it is good macroeconomic policy. It's not just good humanitarian policy to keep them from being hungry or vulnerable. It is good for the economy as a whole. Now, these benefits have expired, and they expired in late July. And to this day, right, here we are in the middle of October, there has been no agreement on the part of politicians in Washington to enact any new legislation. This is still ongoing as we speak, and the sides are very far apart. And I want to be clear, right? The Senate Republicans have basically exempted themselves from this. They've said, we want no part of it. We don't think it's necessary, or we want something so negligible that basically not even the White House is taking seriously the Senate Republican ideas. But I'll just say this for a moment, it appears increasingly that the Senate Republicans think that the next president will be Joe Biden, and they may want a bigger mess for him to deal with. They don't see themselves as having much of an incentive to do anything about this. But the president has been all over the place, right? And his administration has not really had a uniform negotiating stance. He tweets out one thing day to day: I'm canceling these negotiations, let's go big. 2 days later. It's very hard for the Democrats to negotiate with them. But having said that, I do think that the Democrats, Nancy Pelosi and her leadership, bear some of the responsibility here, because they have in a sense, been not entirely unhappy to play politics with this, to say, okay, you're unwilling to do what we want you to do, then it's on your watch that this is going to happen. And by the way, this will drag down your re-election chances, Mr. President. And they may be right about that, but I don't like playing politics with people's ability to feed their children, to keep themselves in their homes. And that's why I've tried to humanize this by starting with the poverty data. I want to be clear, right? We saw in 2007, 2008, 2009, the Great Recession, so-called, waves of foreclosure in which many people lost their homes because their mortgages were unsustainable, because there was a collapse in the housing market bubble, because as a result, they owed more on their homes than their homes were worth. We are going to see another series of waves of evictions and foreclosure if public policy doesn't intervene to prevent it. And when people lose their homes, they become homeless. They are forced to undergo massive dislocation. Again, this is bad for children, bad for families, bad for people. It is especially bad during a pandemic. And so we need to keep track of the human dimension of these policy failures. The overall employment picture is dismal. And I'm showing data now that shows that overall, we have lost over 10 million jobs since February. And I want to be clear, we had lost approaching 20 million jobs in March. We fell off a cliff. And in fact, jobs have come back to a degree, but it is a slow and unsteady march back. And if you saw the most recent job data, you know we actually moved backwards in the last jobs report. And so we still are suffering from widespread unemployment. And again, public policy can do something about this. And the next thing I want you to see here is that there's been a shift in the kinds of jobs lost or job losses that have occurred from temporary layoffs to permanent layoffs, with permanent layoffs making up a larger and larger share of overall job losses. Even as job losses have gone down in June, July, and August, the number of permanent layoffs has gone up as a proportion overall. And again, this does not bode well for the economy. And if we look at this in terms of race or gender, what we see is that these impacts are not even, that the African American unemployment rate is higher than the white unemployment rate, that the Hispanic unemployment rate is higher still, and that more women are losing jobs than men. This is in part because women do more of the care labor in our society, which means taking care of their children. And with schools unreliable and often closed, women have had to make difficult choices, and many have chosen that they will stay home and take care of their children rather than go to work, especially if work is working from home, if daycare is unavailable, if school is closed. It's just unsustainable for a family that has two wage earners to have both of them working at the same time. If we look at this again in terms of the black-white unemployment gap, we see that this has been a persistent problem for the last 20 years. It began to close a little bit in the last few years, but it has opened up widely again. And so I think I would like to just say one or two more things at this point about government policy and what government policy can do during a major economic downturn. One of those things is microeconomic, and we learned this from John Maynard Keynes roughly 100 years ago in the context of the Great Depression, which is that when there is a severe economic downturn, it can be self-reinforcing. That means that if people start losing jobs, they have less money to spend, they buy less goods. Manufacturers or service providers make less money. They then lay off more people, and then that cycle repeats, right? And so a recession or a severe economic contraction can be a downward spiral, and that government can counteract that downward spiral through its policies. We are not doing that sufficiently at the moment. I'm not going to show you the data today, but it is the case that actually one of the largest employers in the American economy is state and local government, and that state and local government does not have the capacity to do deficit spending like the federal government. One of the things we learned in the Great Recession of 2008 is that we stayed in that recession for longer than we needed to, that the recovery was slower and less broadly spread than it could be because we failed to support state and local governments with federal grants and support. And we are repeating that pattern again, and the result is going to be that this recovery, if we don't fix it, is going to be slow and uneven again. The second thing that the government can do is act as a force for equalizing the distribution of wealth, of income, and of well-being. And I'm sorry to say that in the present climate, the only really functioning institution at the federal level for dealing with the severe economic contraction that we're in right now is the Federal Reserve. And that the Federal Reserve's policy instruments tends to benefit large corporations and the people who own shares in large corporations, that is to say the already wealthy. And so they can address liquidity needs for large corporations. They can't address liquidity needs for families other than bringing interest rates down, right? But that's not enough to help small families. So one of the things we've seen is that in the aftermath of the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009, inequality increased. And I'm afraid we're repeating that pattern again. Now, to take this to its conclusion, I just want to say very quickly that we're asking why Donald Trump seems to be in so much trouble in terms of his re-election prospects. And here I will just be direct. It's not only the failure of his administration to handle the coronavirus pandemic, it's also the failure of his administration to handle the economic consequences of the pandemic. And those two things are landing flatly on his shoulders, and it is pulling him down. That's not the kind of thing that a good news cycle changes, or that a campaign rally can do anything about, or a good advertisement can do anything about. So all that to say, I believe that what we are currently seeing in the polls is quite likely to hold through election day. I will stop there, but I'm happy to take questions. Anyone want to start us out?